Have you ever wondered what it feels like when your past catches up to you in the worst possible moment? When the life you've carefully rebuilt comes crashing down because the person who nearly destroyed you refuses to let you go. If you've ever felt that helpless terror, you know exactly what Sophia Chin experienced that Tuesday night in Little Italy. Drop a comment below and let me know what state you're watching from, because this story of protection and redemption could happen anywhere, to anyone who's ever needed a guardian angel to step out of the shadows. The dinner rush at Benedetto's was in full swing, the kind of organized chaos that Sophia Chun had learned to navigate with practiced grace over the past 6 months. Steam rose from plates of osso buco and risotto as she weaved between tables, her dark hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, her movements efficient despite the exhaustion that seemed to live in her bones these days. At 26, she discovered that starting over meant working twice as hard for half as much, but it also meant freedom, and that was worth every aching step. The restaurant hummed with conversation in multiple languages, the kind of authentic Italian establishment where tourists came seeking the real Little Italy experience, and locals gathered for Sunday dinners that lasted until midnight. Sophia had been lucky to find work here after fleeing San Francisco with nothing but a suitcase and her determination to disappear. Lorenzo, the manager, had taken one look at her desperation and given her a chance. No questions asked about her lack of references or the way she flinched when men raised their voices. She was balancing 3 plates of veal marsala when the front door slammed open with enough force to rattle the wine glasses. The cheerful chatter died instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that made the hair on Sophia's neck stand up. She didn't need to turn around to know who had just walked in. Her body recognized the threat before her mind caught up, muscles tensing with the muscle memory of months spent walking on eggshells. Derek Hoffman stood in the doorway like a storm cloud, his blonde hair disheveled and his polo shirt wrinkled from what was clearly a day of drinking. His blue eyes, once charming enough to make her believe in fairy tales, now held the cold fury she remembered from their worst fights. At 32, Derek still carried himself with the entitled confidence of a man who'd never been told no, who'd grown up believing the world owed him everything he wanted. Sophia's hands began to shake, and she carefully set the plates down on the nearest table before the tremors could betray her. 6 months of therapy, 6 months of rebuilding her confidence, 6 months of telling herself she was safe, and all of it crumbled the moment Derek's gaze found hers across the crowded restaurant. "You can't be here," she thought desperately. "You can't have found me." But there he was, moving through the tables like he owned the place, his expensive cologne mixing with the smell of garlic and wine in a way that made her stomach turn. Other diners glanced at him nervously, sensing the tension radiating from his every step. Derek had always been good at making scenes, at turning his personal drama into everyone else's problem. "I told you this wasn't over, Sophia," Derek called out, his voice carrying easily over the hushed restaurant. His words slurred slightly at the edges, confirming what she'd suspected about his condition. "Did you really think you could hide from me forever?" Lorenzo appeared at her side immediately, his weathered face creased with concern. "Call the police," he whispered, but Sophia knew it was too late for that. Derek was already here, already close enough to grab her arm if he wanted to. The restraining order she'd filed in California meant nothing in New York, and Derek had always been charming enough to talk his way out of trouble with authorities. Sophia forced herself to stand straighter, to meet his gaze even as her pulse thundered in her ears. "I'm working, Derek," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You need to leave." Derek laughed, the sound bitter and sharp. "Working? In this dump?" His gesture encompassed the elegant restaurant with its exposed brick walls and hand-painted murals, dismissing months of Sophia's careful rebuilding with casual cruelty. "You used to have standards, baby. Remember when you wouldn't settle for anything less than 5 stars? The reminder of their old life together, of the woman she'd been when she thought love meant accepting whatever scraps of affection Derek chose to give her, made something cold and angry unfurl in Sophia's chest. "Those standards were yours, not mine," she replied quietly. "And they came with a price I wasn't willing to pay anymore." Derek's face darkened at her defiance, and he took another step closer. Several diners had begun gathering their belongings, clearly uncomfortable with the mounting tension. Sophia could see Lorenzo on his phone, probably calling for backup, but she knew Derek wouldn't wait long enough for help to arrive. He never had been patient when he wanted something. We had everything, Sophia, Derek continued, his voice taking on the wheedling tone she remembered from his apologies after the worst fights. The penthouse, the cars, the trips to Napa. All you had to do was stop being so damn stubborn about everything. All you had to do was trust me. Trust you? The words came out sharper than Sophia intended, months of suppressed anger finally finding their voice. Trust you to control every aspect of my life. Trust you to isolate me from my friends and family. Trust you to make me feel like I was crazy for wanting basic respect. Derek's mask slipped completely then, revealing the cold rage underneath. You ungrateful little bitch, he snarled, lunging forward. You think you can embarrass me like this? Make me look like a fool? Sophia stumbled backward, her hip hitting the edge of a table hard enough to send wine glasses tumbling. The crash seemed to echo in the sudden silence, and she realized with growing horror that every eye in the restaurant was now focused on their confrontation. This was exactly what Derek wanted, to make her the center of a scene, to strip away the quiet dignity she'd worked so hard to rebuild. But then a new voice cut through the chaos, calm and controlled in a way that made the air itself seem to still. I think the lady asked you to leave. Sophia turned to see a man rising from a corner table, moving with the kind of fluid grace that spoke of complete confidence in his own power. He was tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair styled impeccably and olive skin that suggested Italian heritage. His suit was clearly expensive, the kind of tailored perfection that cost more than Sophia made in 3 months. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. They were the color of storm clouds, gray-green, and completely focused on Derek with an intensity that would have made a wiser man reconsider his choices. This was Matteo Romano, though Sophia didn't know his name yet. She only knew that something fundamental had shifted in the restaurant's atmosphere the moment he'd spoken, as if the very air recognized the presence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This is none of your business, friend," Derek said, but Sophia could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Derek was used to intimidating women and service workers, not men who looked like they could break him in half without wrinkling their expensive suits. Matteo smiled then, the expression cold and predatory. "Actually," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that made his words sound like a promise, "when you disrupt my dinner and frighten the staff at my favorite restaurant, it becomes very much my business." Derek straightened to his full height, trying to project the authority that had once made Sophia feel so small. "Look, I don't know who you think you are, but this is between me and my girlfriend. So why don't you sit back down and mind your own business before something happens that we'll both regret?" The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Sophia held her breath, waiting for Matteo's response. She'd seen Derek intimidate plenty of men before, using his size and his family's money to get his way. But Matteo didn't seem impressed. If anything, he looked almost amused. "Your girlfriend?" Matteo asked, his gaze shifting to Sophia with something that might have been concern. "Miss, is this man your boyfriend?" Sophia shook her head quickly, finding her voice despite the fear that still gripped her throat. "No," she said firmly. "He's my ex. I have a restraining order against him in California." Matteo nodded slowly, as if this information confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then I believe you heard the lady," he said to Derek. "She's asked you to leave. The restaurant has asked you to leave. Now I'm asking you to leave. I suggest you do so while I'm still asking politely." Derek's face flushed red with embarrassment and rage. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he demanded. "Some kind of tough guy because you've got an expensive suit?" Matteo's smile widened, but it never reached his eyes. "I'm someone who doesn't like to repeat himself," he said quietly. "And I'm someone who takes a very dim view of men who can't seem to understand simple words like no and stop." The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Every conversation stopped as diners watched the confrontation unfold. Sophia could see Lorenzo hovering near the kitchen, his phone still pressed to his ear, but she had the feeling that whatever help he'd called for wouldn't arrive in time to matter. Derek looked around the room, perhaps finally realizing that he was outnumbered and outclassed. But his pride wouldn't let him back down gracefully, and Sophia knew from painful experience that Derek's pride was often more dangerous than his anger. "This isn't over, Sophia," Derek said, pointing a finger at her. "You belong to me. You always have. and you always will. And when you come crawling back because you can't handle the real world without me, I might not be feeling so generous." He turned to leave then, but Mateo's voice stopped him at the door. "Actually," Mateo said conversationally, "I think it is over. Completely over. And if you happen to find yourself in this neighborhood again, or anywhere near Miss Chun, I hope you'll remember this conversation and make better choices." Derek's hand was on the door handle, his knuckles white with tension. "Is that some kind of threat?" Mateo shrugged elegantly. "I prefer to think of it as friendly advice. The kind that wise men take to heart." Derek stared at him for a long moment, clearly weighing his options. But something in Mateo's calm certainty must have finally penetrated his alcohol-fueled bravado, because he pushed through the door without another word, disappearing into the night like the bad dream Sophia had always hoped he would become. The silence that followed his departure felt different from the tense quiet that had preceded it. Slowly, conversations began to resume, diners returning to their meals with the determined normalcy of people pretending they hadn't just witnessed something deeply uncomfortable. Sophia realized she was still shaking, her hands trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. She'd spent so long looking over her shoulder, so many months jumping at shadows, and now Derek had found her anyway. All her careful precautions, all her planning, and it hadn't mattered. "Wait outside," Mateo said quietly, and it took Sophia a moment to realize he was speaking to her. "I'll take care of this." She looked up at him, this strange man who had stepped between her and her worst nightmare without hesitation, and felt something crack open in her chest. For 6 months, she'd been handling everything alone, making every decision by herself, depending on no one because depending on people had only ever brought her pain. But standing there in the wreckage of her carefully rebuilt peace, she found herself nodding. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. "Thank you for helping me." Mateo's expression softened then, the predatory coldness replaced by something warmer. "No one should have to face their demons alone," he said simply. "Especially not in my city." And as Sophia gathered her purse and coat, her hands still shaking with the aftermath of terror and relief, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed in ways she couldn't yet understand. The man who had saved her was clearly dangerous in his own right, probably more dangerous than Derek could ever dream of being. But for the first time in 6 months, she didn't feel alone. Outside, the New York night was crisp and alive with possibility, and Sophia Chun waited for a stranger to take care of the situation she'd been running from for half a year. The November air bit through Sophia's thin work blouse as she stood outside Benedetto's, her breath forming small clouds in the lamplight. Her hands had finally stopped shaking, but her mind was racing, replaying every moment of Derek's unexpected appearance and the stranger who had stepped between them. She wrapped her arms around herself, less from the cold and more from the surreal nature of what had just happened. Through the restaurant's large windows, she could see Mateo speaking quietly with Lorenzo, their conversation too muted to hear, but clearly intense. The other diners had returned to their meals, though she caught several curious glances in her direction. She'd become the evening's entertainment, the damsel in distress whose drama had interrupted their peaceful dinners. The thought made her cheeks burn with embarrassment. The door chimed softly as Mateo emerged, and Sophia found herself studying him more carefully now that the immediate crisis had passed. He moved with the kind of controlled grace that suggested either military training or something more dangerous, and his expensive suit fit him like it had been crafted specifically for his broad shoulders and lean frame. His dark hair was slightly mussed now, probably from running his fingers through it while talking to Lorenzo, and the gesture made him seem more human somehow. "Are you all right?" Mateo asked, his voice gentler than it had been when facing Derek. The storm cloud intensity was gone from his eyes, replaced by something that looked almost like concern. Sophia nodded, then shook her head, then shrugged helplessly. "I don't know," she admitted. "I keep thinking I should be more upset, but mostly I'm just confused. How did he find me? I was so careful." Mateo's expression darkened slightly. "Men like that, they don't give up easily. They see what they want as theirs, regardless of what the woman wants." His accent was more pronounced now, rolling through the words with a musical quality that made even his anger sound somehow soothing. "You know men like Derek?" The question slipped out before Sophia could stop it, and she immediately regretted the assumption. She didn't know anything about this man, despite what he'd just done for her. I know bullies, Matteo said simply, and I know that they rarely stop at one confrontation. He studied her face in the streetlight, taking in her pale skin and the way she kept glancing over her shoulder. Where are you staying? Do you have somewhere safe to go tonight? The question made Sophia's stomach clench with a new kind of anxiety. Her tiny studio apartment in Queens suddenly felt impossibly far away and completely inadequate as protection against Derek's determination. I have an apartment, she said slowly. But if Derek found the restaurant, he probably knows where I live too. Matteo nodded as if this confirmed his worst fears. Lorenzo told me you've been working here for 6 months, that you came from California. He also told me you're one of the hardest workers he's ever had, and that you never cause trouble. His tone suggested that Lorenzo's opinion carried significant weight. The revelation that they'd been discussing her made Sophia's cheeks warm again. She wasn't used to being the subject of conversations between powerful men, wasn't comfortable with the idea that her business was being shared, even with good intentions. What else did Lorenzo tell you? That you're running from something dangerous, and that you deserve better than whatever brought you here, Matteo said matter-of-factly. And that if something happened to you, he'd blame himself for not doing more to protect you. The simple statement hit Sophia harder than she expected, bringing unexpected tears to her eyes. In 6 months of working at Benedetto's, she'd thought she was just another employee to Lorenzo, just another waitress in the endless parade of service workers that moved through restaurant kitchens. The idea that he cared enough to worry about her safety was almost overwhelming. I should go home, she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. I should call the police and report that Derek violated his restraining order. Matteo was already shaking his head before she finished speaking. The restraining order was filed in California, he pointed out gently. It has no legal standing here, and by the time you file a new one, he could already have made his next move. His practicality was unsettling, suggesting a familiarity with legal loopholes that made Sophia wonder exactly who she was talking to. Then what am I supposed to do? The question came out sharper than she intended, months of carefully controlled fear finally bleeding through her composure. Run again? Change my name again? Keep looking over my shoulder for the rest of my life? You let me help you, Matteo said simply. At least for tonight. Let me make sure you get home safely, and we'll figure out the rest tomorrow. The offer was generous, but it also raised questions that Sophia wasn't sure she wanted answered. She'd learned the hard way that accepting help from powerful men often came with strings attached, and Matteo Romano was clearly very powerful indeed. But the alternative was going home alone to an apartment that Derek might already know about, and that prospect made her skin crawl. Why would you help me? She asked. You don't even know me. Matteo was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on something distant down the street. Because someone should have helped my sister when she needed it, he said finally. And because no one deserves to live in fear of someone who claims to love them. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled but unmistakable, and Sophia felt something shift in her understanding of this strange man who had stepped into her crisis. He wasn't just being chivalrous or showing off his power. He was carrying his own wounds, his own reasons for standing between predators and their prey. My car is just around the corner, Matteo said, gesturing toward a sleek black sedan that probably cost more than Sophia had made in her entire life. If you're comfortable with it, I can drive you home. We can stop by your apartment so you can pack a bag, and then I can arrange somewhere safe for you to stay while we figure out a more permanent solution. The suggestion was reasonable, but it also meant trusting a complete stranger with not just her immediate safety, but her living situation. Sophia had spent 6 months learning to depend only on herself, making every decision independently, because depending on others had only ever led to disappointment and control. But Derek's appearance changed everything. All her careful planning and independence meant nothing if he could track her down whenever he wanted. And this man, whatever else he might be, had already proven that he was willing to stand up to Derek when no one else would. Okay, she said quietly, but just for tonight. I can figure out something more permanent tomorrow. Matteo smiled then, the first genuine warmth she'd seen from him, and the expression transformed his entire face. Of course, he said, whatever makes you feel safe. The drive to Queens was quiet, filled with the kind of comfortable silence that Sophia hadn't expected. Matteo's car was as luxurious as she'd imagined, all leather seats and subtle technology, but he drove carefully and kept the music low. He didn't press her with questions about Derek or her past, seeming to understand that she'd already shared more than she was comfortable with. It wasn't until they were stopped at a red light that Sophia finally worked up the courage to ask the question that had been nagging at her since Lorenzo mentioned Matteo's name with such obvious respect. "What do you do?" she asked. "For work, I mean. The restaurant seemed to know who you are." Matteo's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel, and Sophia caught a glimpse of expensive watch beneath his suit cuff. "Family business," he said after a moment. "Import and export, some real estate, a few restaurants. Nothing too exciting." The carefully neutral answer told Sophia more than a detailed explanation would have. Men who described their work as nothing too exciting while wearing $1,000 suits and commanding immediate respect in Little Italy were usually involved in something significantly more complex than legitimate business ventures. But before she could decide how she felt about that realization, they were pulling up in front of her building, and Sophia's attention was immediately focused on scanning the street for any sign of Derek's presence. The block looked normal, just another row of converted apartments in Queens, but she found herself checking every shadow twice. Matteo seemed to be doing the same thing, his trained gaze sweeping the area with professional efficiency. "I'll come up with you," he said, not making it a question, "just to make sure everything looks normal." Sophia's apartment was on the third floor of a walk-up that had seen better decades, and she felt acutely aware of the building's shabby condition as Matteo followed her up the narrow stairs. The contrast between his obvious wealth and her careful penny-pinching was embarrassing, but he didn't seem to notice the peeling paint or the broken light fixture on the second-floor landing. Her studio apartment was exactly what $800 a month got you in Queens: small, clean, and furnished with whatever she'd been able to find at thrift stores and on Craigslist. But it was hers, earned with her own work and arranged according to her own preferences, and that independence had been worth every compromise. Matteo waited in the doorway while she packed an overnight bag, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. Having a man in her space again, even one who had helped her, triggered memories that she'd spent months trying to forget. But his careful respect for her boundaries, the way he stayed exactly where she'd left him without exploring or commenting, slowly eased the tension in her shoulders. It was while she was grabbing clothes from her tiny closet that her phone buzzed with an incoming call. Derek's name on the screen made her blood turn to ice, and Matteo was beside her instantly, though she hadn't made a sound. "Don't answer it," he said quietly, but it was too late. The call had already gone to voicemail, and they could both see the notification appearing on her screen. Sophia played the message on speaker, her hands shaking again as Derek's voice filled the small space. "I know you're listening to this, baby." His tone was different now, less angry and more manipulative, the voice he used when he wanted to convince her that his jealousy was really love. "I saw that guy you were with tonight. Real impressive, some guinea in an expensive suit thinking he can play knight in shining armor. But we both know he's not going to stick around once he figures out what kind of baggage you come with." Matteo's expression had gone completely cold again, and Sophia could see the controlled anger building in his posture. "You can play house with your new friend for as long as you want," Derek continued, his voice taking on the edge that meant his patience was running thin. "But eventually you're going to remember who you really belong to. And when you do, when you come crawling back because the real world is too hard for someone like you, I might not be feeling so forgiving. Sleep tight, Sophia. Sweet dreams." The message ended, leaving them standing in silence while the implications sank in. Derek hadn't just found her by accident. He'd been watching, learning her routines, probably following her home from work. The thought made Sophia feel sick and violated all over again. "Pack everything you need for a few days," Matteo said, his voice carefully controlled. "You're not staying here tonight, and you're not coming back until this situation is handled." The commanding tone should have triggered all of Sophia's hard-earned wariness about controlling men, but instead she felt only relief. For 6 months, she'd been making all the hard decisions alone, carrying the full weight of her safety and future on her own shoulders. The idea of letting someone else take charge, even temporarily, was almost overwhelmingly tempting. "Where will I go?" she asked, shoving more clothes into her bag with hands that still weren't quite steady. Matteo was quiet for a moment, and when she looked up, his expression was carefully neutral again. I have a penthouse in Manhattan, he said. It's secure, and there's plenty of space. You'd have complete privacy, and we could figure out a long-term solution once we know more about what Derek's planning. The offer was incredibly generous, but it also meant accepting help from a man she'd known for less than 2 hours. Every instinct she'd developed over the past 6 months screamed warnings about trusting too quickly, about the price that powerful men usually demanded for their protection. But Derek's message had made one thing clear. He wasn't going away, and her carefully constructed independence wasn't going to be enough to keep her safe. I don't know how to thank you, Sophia said quietly, zipping up her bag. And I don't know how I'll ever repay you for this. Matteo moved to take her bag, and their fingers brushed briefly as he lifted it from her hands. The contact was electric, sending an unexpected jolt of awareness through her entire body. You don't owe me anything, he said, his voice rougher than it had been. Sometimes people help each other because it's the right thing to do, not because they expect something in return. But as they left her apartment behind and drove toward Manhattan, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that accepting Matteo Romano's protection was going to change her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. He was clearly dangerous, clearly involved in things that operated outside normal legal boundaries, and clearly powerful enough to make problems like Derek simply disappear. The question was whether he was dangerous to her enemies or dangerous to her heart. And as she watched the city lights blur past the window, Sophia realized she wasn't entirely sure which possibility scared her more. Matteo's penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a building that probably cost more than most people's houses, and Sophia felt increasingly out of place with every step deeper into his world. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Manhattan's skyline, while modern furniture that belonged in design magazines filled spaces larger than her entire queen's apartment. Everything was sleek and expensive and absolutely perfect, making her acutely aware of her discount store clothes and secondhand purse. The guest room he showed her was bigger than any bedroom she'd ever had, complete with an in-soot bathroom that featured a marble shower and a bathtub deep enough to swim in. Fluffy white towels were folded with hotel precision, and the bed looked like something from a luxury resort advertisement. It was beautiful and generous and completely overwhelming. This is too much, Sophia said, setting her small overnight bag on the pristine comforter with hands that felt suddenly clumsy. I can't possibly accept all this. I should find a hotel or something. Matteo paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable. At 3 a.m? With someone like Derek potentially watching hotel registrations? His logic was frustratingly sound, but the practical arguments didn't ease the discomfort churning in Sophia's stomach. I don't know how to be someone's charity case, she admitted quietly. I've spent 6 months learning to take care of myself, and now I'm right back to depending on a man I barely know. The words came out more bitter than she intended, months of hard-won independence crashing against the reality of needing help. You're not charity, Matteo said firmly. You're someone in danger who deserves protection. There's a difference. He leaned against the doorframe, and something in his posture made him seem less intimidating and more tired. When my sister needed help, no one offered. Everyone who could have made a difference looked the other way because it was easier than getting involved. The pain in his voice was carefully controlled, but Sophia could hear the old anger underneath. What happened to your sister? She asked softly, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. She married the wrong man, Matteo said after a long pause. Someone who seemed charming and successful on the surface, but was cruel when no one was watching. By the time the family realized what was happening, she was too isolated and too afraid to ask for help. He stopped speaking then, but the weight of unfinished tragedy hung heavy in the silence. Sophia's heart clenched with recognition and sympathy. Derek had been charming too, especially in the beginning when he was working to win her trust. The transition from romance to control had been so gradual that she'd almost convinced herself it was normal, that love was supposed to feel like walking on eggshells. I'm sorry, she said, meaning it completely. I know how hard it is to watch someone you care about disappear into that kind of relationship. Matteo nodded, his jaw tight with old grief. Maria died in a car accident 2 years ago, but we all knew it wasn't really an accident. Her husband had been drinking and driving with her in the car for months, and she was too scared to refuse to get in. The police called it vehicular manslaughter, but the family knew better. The The stark honesty of his admission made Sophia's chest tight with emotion. She'd spent so many months feeling ashamed of staying with Derek as long as she had, ashamed of how long it had taken her to find the courage to leave. But hearing Mateo talk about his sister's fear made her realize that shame was just another weapon abusers use to keep their victims isolated. So when you see someone like Derek, she said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn, you can't just walk away. I refuse to be another person who looks the other way, Mateo confirmed. And you deserve better than having to face someone like that alone. His voice carried absolute conviction, and Sophia felt something warm unfold in her chest at the simple statement of her worth. Thank you, she whispered, for everything, for standing up to him, for bringing me here, for not making me feel like a burden. Mateo's expression softened then, the hard edges of his anger giving way to something gentler. Get some rest, he said. We'll figure out the next steps in the morning. But despite the luxurious bed and the safety of locked doors and security systems, Sophia found herself lying awake staring at the ceiling. Every small sound made her jump, and her mind kept cycling through worst-case scenarios involving Derek and his threats. She'd grown accustomed to sleeping lightly over the past 6 months, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt like the beginning of something she couldn't control. She finally gave up on sleep around 6 in the morning, padding quietly to the kitchen in search of coffee. But she stopped short when she found Mateo already there, standing at the stove in dark pajama pants and a gray t-shirt that showed off the lean muscle of his arms and chest. He looked younger without his expensive suit, more approachable, though no less attractive. Good morning, he said without turning around, somehow knowing she was there despite her careful silence. I thought you might be up early. Coffee's almost ready. The domesticity of the scene was unexpectedly appealing. Sophia had spent so many months eating meals alone, making coffee for one, never sharing morning conversations with anyone. Watching Mateo move around his kitchen with easy familiarity made something lonely inside her chest warm with possibility. You didn't have to cook, she said, noticing the elaborate breakfast spread he was preparing. Eggs Benedict, fresh fruit, what looked like homemade pastries cooling on the counter. I like to cook, Mateo said, finally turning to offer her a cup of coffee prepared exactly the way she preferred it despite never asking her preference. And I figured you probably didn't eat much last night after everything that happened. He was right. Her stomach had been too knotted with anxiety to handle food, and now the smell of real breakfast made her realize how hungry she actually was. This is incredible, she said, accepting the coffee gratefully. Where did you learn to cook like this? My mother, Mateo replied with a slight smile. She insisted that all her sons learn to take care of themselves properly. Said she wasn't going to send us into the world expecting women to wait on us hand and foot. The fondness in his voice when he mentioned his mother made Sophia curious about his family dynamics. How many brothers do you have? She asked, settling onto one of the sleek bar stools that overlooked the kitchen island. 2 younger ones, Mateo said, plating the eggs Benedict with restaurant-quality precision. Marco and Alessandro. Marco works with me, and Alessandro is finishing law school at Columbia. He handed her a plate that looked like something from a 5-star brunch menu, complete with perfectly poached eggs and hollandaise sauce. The food was as delicious as it looked, and Sophia found herself relaxing despite everything as they ate together in comfortable conversation. Mateo was surprisingly easy to talk to when he wasn't in protective mode, asking thoughtful questions about her work at the restaurant and her plans before Derek had disrupted everything. I was saving money to go back to school, she admitted between bites of the most perfect eggs Benedict she'd ever tasted. I have a degree in graphic design, but I never got to use it much. Derek thought creative careers were impractical, so I ended up working in his father's real estate office doing data entry. The admission made her cringe slightly. Looking back, she could see how systematically Derek had undermined her confidence and independence, but at the time his concerns had seemed reasonable. He'd made her doubt her own abilities so gradually that she'd almost believed she wasn't capable of anything more challenging. What changed? Mateo asked gently. What made you finally decide to leave? Sophia was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee while she decided how much truth she was ready to share. He hit me, she said finally. Not for the first time, but it was the worst time. And afterward, when I was sitting in the emergency room lying to the nurse about falling downstairs, I realized that I had 2 choices. I could stay and let him kill me slowly, or I could leave and take my chances with the world. Mateo's fork had stopped moving, and when Sophia looked up, his expression was carefully neutral in a way that somehow conveyed more rage than shouting would have. What did the hospital do? He asked quietly. They patched me up and sent me home with pamphlets about domestic violence resources, Sophia said with bitter accuracy. The nurse knew I was lying, but she couldn't make me tell the truth. And Derek was waiting in the parking lot with flowers and apologies and promises that it would never happen again. The memory still made her stomach turn with shame and anger. She'd wanted so desperately to believe that Derek's tears were genuine, that his remorse meant something. But by then she'd heard the same promises too many times to trust them anymore. So you started planning, Mateo said. It wasn't a question. It took me 3 months to save enough money and arrange everything without him noticing, Sophia confirmed. I had to hide cash in my makeup bag and research apartments on library computers. I practiced the conversation where I told my boss I was quitting, and I bought my plane ticket the day before I used it. That took incredible courage, Mateo said, and the simple statement of admiration made Sophia's chest tight with unexpected emotion. A lot of people never find the strength to leave. They were interrupted by the sound of the front door opening, followed by footsteps and voices in the entryway. Mateo was on his feet immediately, his posture shifting from relaxed to alert in the space of a heartbeat. Stay here, he told Sophia quietly, but his tone was calm rather than worried. Boss, a male voice called from the living room. We need to talk. That's Marco, Mateo explained to Sophia. My second-in-command. He has keys for emergencies, but he wouldn't use them unless something important happened. Mateo disappeared into the living room, and Sophia could hear the low murmur of intense conversation, though she couldn't make out specific words. The tone was serious enough to make her nervous, especially when she heard Derek's name mentioned several times. When Mateo returned a few minutes later, he was accompanied by 2 people who were obviously part of his inner circle. The man was probably in his late 20s, with dark hair and nervous energy that reminded Sophia of a coiled spring. The woman was older, maybe 50, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of competent presence that suggested she'd been managing things for a long time. Sophia, Mateo said, I'd like you to meet Marco Santelli, my business partner, and Rosa Benedetto, who basically runs my life. His tone was warm with genuine affection for both of them. Marco stepped forward first, offering a polite nod. Miss Chen, I'm sorry we have to meet under these circumstances, but I want you to know that you're safe here. We take care of family, and anyone under Mateo's protection is family. The statement was clearly meant to be reassuring, but it also raised questions about exactly what kind of business required this level of loyalty and protection. Rosa's greeting was warmer, offering a motherly smile that made Sophia feel immediately welcomed. You look like you could use someone to worry about you properly, Rosa said with the kind of directness that brooked no argument. I'll make sure you have everything you need while you're staying here. What's the situation with Derek? Mateo asked Marco, getting straight to business in a way that made Sophia's stomach clench with anxiety. Marco's expression grew serious. He's been busy since last night. Vandalized the ladies' apartment building, keyed a few cars, left some nasty messages with the superintendent. Building management called the police, but there wasn't much they could do except file a report. Sophia's blood ran cold at the news. Derek had always been vindictive when he didn't get his way, but vandalizing property was escalation beyond his usual patterns. It meant he was getting desperate, and desperate Derek was infinitely more dangerous than angry Derek. He also made some calls, Marco continued. Trying to find out who you are, boss. Nothing too sophisticated, but he's definitely fishing for information about your business and your personal life. The implications of Derek investigating Mateo made Sophia feel sick with guilt and terror. She'd already brought danger into this man's life just by accepting his help, and now Derek was actively trying to find ways to hurt him. I'm sorry, she said quickly. I never meant for this to affect you. Maybe I should leave, find somewhere else to stay until this blows over. But Mateo was already shaking his head before she finished speaking. You're not going anywhere, he said firmly. Derek escalated because he's losing control of the situation. That makes him more dangerous, not less dangerous. And it means you need protection more than ever. The conviction in his voice was absolute, but Sophia could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. This wasn't just about her safety anymore. Derek had made it personal by targeting Mateo's property and investigating his business. In the world Mateo clearly operated in, that kind of disrespect probably demanded a response. "What do you want us to do about the boyfriend?" Marco asked, and something in his tone suggested that the options being considered went well beyond calling the police. "Ex-boyfriend," Sophia corrected quickly, though she suspected the distinction wouldn't matter much to men like Marco and Mateo. "We handle it carefully," Mateo said after a moment of consideration. "No permanent solutions unless he escalates further. But make sure he understands that his behavior has consequences. And find out everything there is to know about Derek Hoffman. Background, financials, habits, weaknesses. I want to know what kind of man we're dealing with." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Marco and Mateo discussing security measures and contingency plans in language that was both professional and vaguely threatening. Sophia found herself both grateful for their thorough approach and disturbed by how naturally they discussed handling threats to their safety. When Marco finally left with his orders, Rosa lingered to fuss over breakfast dishes and make sure Sophia had everything she needed. The older woman's maternal attention was both comforting and overwhelming for someone who'd been handling everything alone for so long. After Rosa departed with promises to return later with proper groceries, Sophia and Mateo found themselves alone again in the sudden quiet of his penthouse. The morning's revelations about Derek's escalation had shifted the atmosphere between them, creating an intimacy born of shared danger and mutual dependence. "I should probably call in sick to work," Sophia said, though the words felt strange. She'd never missed a shift at Benedetto's, had prided herself on being reliable and professional despite everything else falling apart in her life. "I already spoke to Lorenzo," Mateo said gently. "He's giving you paid time off until this situation is resolved. The restaurant's position is that you were threatened by a customer, and they're supporting you completely." The kindness of the gesture made Sophia's eyes burn with unexpected tears. She'd grown so accustomed to handling crisis alone that having people actively work to make her life easier felt almost overwhelming. "You don't have to take care of everything," she said softly. "I'm not used to letting other people solve my problems." Mateo moved closer then, close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the flecks of green in his gray eyes. "You're not letting me do anything," he said quietly. "I'm choosing to help because I want to, because you deserve to be protected, and because I can't stand the thought of someone like Derek hurting you." The intensity in his voice made Sophia's breath catch, and suddenly the space between them felt charged with something that went beyond gratitude or simple attraction. Mateo was looking at her like she was precious, like she was worth fighting for, and the expression made her feel more valuable than she had in years. "Mateo," she whispered, not sure what she was asking for, but knowing that something fundamental was shifting between them. He reached up slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away, and cupped her cheek gently. His touch was warm and careful, nothing like Derek's possessive grabbing or demanding embraces. This felt like a question rather than a demand, like an invitation rather than an expectation. "Is this okay?" he asked softly, and the simple request for consent made something tight in Sophia's chest unfurl with relief and desire. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and let her eyes flutter closed as he leaned closer. She could feel his breath against her lips, could feel the tension and anticipation building between them like electricity before a storm. But just as the distance between them closed to nothing, Mateo's phone rang with an urgent tone that made them both freeze. "I'm sorry," he said, his forehead resting against hers for a moment. "I have to take this. Business doesn't wait for convenient timing." The moment broke as he stepped away to answer the call, leaving Sophia standing alone in his kitchen with her heart racing and her lips tingling with anticipation of a kiss that hadn't quite happened. But as she listened to Mateo's conversation shift into the kind of hard-edged Italian that suggested serious business problems, she realized that almost being kissed by him had taught her something important. For the first time in 6 months, for the first time since Derek's final violent outburst had sent her fleeing across the country, Sophia felt completely safe. Not just physically protected by Mateo's obvious power and resources, but emotionally safe in a way that had nothing to do with security systems or bodyguards. She was falling for a man who was clearly dangerous, clearly involved in activities that operated outside normal legal boundaries, and clearly powerful enough to make problems disappear permanently. But as she watched him handle whatever crisis had interrupted their moment, Sophia realized that the most dangerous thing about Matteo Romano wasn't his connections or his influence. The most dangerous thing about him was how much she was beginning to trust him, how much she wanted to let him take care of her, and how much she was starting to believe that maybe she'd found someone who would never hurt her the way Derek had. That level of trust was terrifying for someone who'd learned the hard way that love and control often wore the same mask. But as Sophia cleaned up their breakfast dishes in Matteo's perfect kitchen, she couldn't shake the feeling that this time might be different. This time might be safe. 3 days of living in Matteo's penthouse had established a rhythm that felt both comfortable and dangerously appealing to Sophia. Morning coffee together before he left for business meetings, quiet dinners where they talked about everything except the obvious attraction simmering between them, and long evenings where she tried to read while hyper-aware of his presence across the room. It was the kind of domestic intimacy she'd never experienced with Derek, whose idea of togetherness had involved constant demands for attention and validation. But tonight felt different. Matteo had been quieter than usual during dinner, and Sophia could sense something weighing on his mind as they settled in his living room afterward. She was curled up on one end of his massive leather sofa with a book she wasn't really reading, while he sat at the other end reviewing what looked like business contracts. The comfortable silence stretched between them until Matteo finally set aside his papers and turned to face her fully. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice carefully gentle. "About what Derek did to you." Sophia's hands tightened on her book, and she felt the familiar tension that came with discussions of her past. Most people wanted just enough details to satisfy their curiosity without having to really understand the complexity of abuse. But something in Matteo's expression suggested he was asking for different reasons. "What do you want to know?" she asked quietly. "All of it," Matteo said simply. "I need to understand what he's capable of, what he's done before, so I can better protect you. But more than that, I want to understand what you've survived, because I think you're stronger than you realize." The honest admission made Sophia's chest tight with emotion. Derek had always made her feel weak for staying, weak for leaving, weak for caring what happened to her. But Matteo was asking about her experiences like they mattered, like understanding her pain might help him help her. She set down her book and drew her knees up to her chest, needing the defensive posture as she prepared to share details she'd never spoken aloud. "It started small," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Comments about my clothes, my friends, my job. He'd say things like he was worried about me or trying to help me improve myself." Matteo's expression darkened, but he remained quiet, letting her tell the story at her own pace. "Then it was isolating me from people who might notice changes," Sophia continued. "He convinced me that my friends were jealous of our relationship, that my family didn't understand what real love looked like. He made me quit my design job because he said the creative industry was full of predators who would take advantage of me." The progression sounded so logical when she laid it out chronologically, but living through it had felt like a gradual erosion of everything she'd thought she knew about herself. Derek had been so skilled at making his control feel like protection that she'd almost thanked him for limiting her world to just him. "When did it become physical?" Matteo asked, and though his voice remained gentle, Sophia could see the carefully controlled anger building in his posture. "About 8 months into the relationship," she said. "I made dinner plans with my sister without asking him first, and when I got home, he grabbed my wrist hard enough to leave bruises. But afterward he cried and apologized, and said he'd been scared of losing me. He made it sound romantic, like his jealousy proved how much he loved me." Matteo's hands had clenched into fists, and Sophia could see him working to control his reaction. She appreciated that he was trying to stay calm for her sake, because she'd learned that men's anger, even righteous anger, could feel threatening when you'd spent months being afraid. It escalated from there, she continued. Shoving, slapping, throwing things. But he was smart about it. Never anywhere that would show at work, never in front of other people. And always with explanations about why it was my fault, why I'd pushed him too far, why he wouldn't have to hurt me if I would just listen better. The words came easier now that she'd started, months of therapy having taught her that naming the patterns of abuse helped strip away some of their power. But sharing them with Mateo felt different from sharing them with her therapist. This felt like trusting someone with her damage, like asking him to see the worst of what she'd endured and choose to stay anyway. The night I finally left, Sophia said, her voice growing steadier as she approached the end of her story, he beat me unconscious because I'd contradicted him in front of his friends. I woke up on our kitchen floor 6 hours later with a concussion and 3 cracked ribs. And when I called him from the hospital, he said it was my fault for embarrassing him. Mateo was completely still now, his gray-green eyes dark with fury that was carefully banked but unmistakably lethal. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with barely controlled emotion. "I'm going to kill him," he said quietly. "Not eventually, not if he escalates. I'm going to find Derek Hoffman, and I'm going to end his miserable existence for what he did to you." The casual declaration of murderous intent should have terrified Sophia, but instead she felt something warm and fierce unfurl in her chest. After months of people telling her to be reasonable, to consider Derek's perspective, to think about forgiveness and moving forward, having someone simply acknowledge that Derek deserved to pay for his cruelty was almost overwhelming. "You can't," she said, though the protest felt half-hearted. "You'd go to prison, and then Derek would win anyway." Mateo's smile was cold and predatory. "Men like me don't go to prison for removing threats, Kara. We go to prison for getting caught, and I'm very good at not getting caught." The endearment rolled off his tongue like music, and Sophia felt her heart skip at the casual intimacy of being called Kara in his low, accented voice. She'd never had a man call her darling in Italian, had never experienced the way Mateo's protective fury felt like shelter rather than another source of danger. Before she could second-guess herself, Sophia moved across the sofa to sit closer to him, drawn by the warmth and safety he represented. Mateo went very still as she approached, his eyes searching her face for any sign of fear or uncertainty. "Thank you," she said softly, reaching up to touch his cheek. "For listening, for believing me, for wanting to protect me. No one has ever made me feel like what happened to me mattered before." Mateo turned his head to press a kiss to her palm, the gesture so tender that it made her breath catch. "Everything about you matters to me," he said quietly. "Your safety, your happiness, your peace of mind. You deserve to be cherished, not controlled." The simple declaration broke something open in Sophia's chest, months of careful emotional control crumbling under the weight of being seen and valued so completely. Before she could lose her courage, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft and sweet, and everything Derek's kisses had never been. Mateo's hands came up to frame her face gently, his touch reverent rather than possessive, asking rather than demanding. When they finally broke apart, Sophia felt dizzy with the realization that this was what safety felt like. This was what it meant to be wanted without being owned. Over the next few days, their relationship deepened in ways that felt natural and unhurried. Mateo introduced her to his mother, Elena Romano, a tiny, elegant woman in her 70s who took one look at Sophia and declared her perfect for her difficult oldest son. The family dinner at Elena's house in the Bronx was warm and chaotic, and everything Sophia's own small family gatherings had never been, and she found herself laughing more in one evening than she had in the entire year with Derek. When her younger sister Lily visited the penthouse later that week, Sophia felt nervous about the inevitable questions and judgments. But Lily took one look at how Mateo treated her, the way he anticipated her needs and listened to her opinions and made space for her voice in every conversation, and gave her approval immediately. "He's nothing like Derek," Lily said privately while Mateo was taking a business call. "The way he looks at you, soft, like you're the most important thing in his world. That's how it's supposed to be." The validation from her sister meant everything to Sophia, especially since Lily had been the one person who'd consistently tried to warn her about Derek's controlling behavior. Having her sister's blessing felt like permission to trust her own instincts about Mateo's character. That night, when they were alone again in the quiet luxury of his penthouse, Sophia made the decision that had been building between them for days. She found Mateo in his bedroom reviewing security reports, and something about the domestic intimacy of the moment gave her the courage to voice what she'd been feeling. "I want to be with you," she said simply. "Not just staying here for safety, but really with you. If you want that too." Mateo set aside his papers immediately, giving her his complete attention. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I don't want you to feel like you owe me anything, or like you have to choose this because I'm protecting you. The careful consideration for her autonomy made Sophia even more certain of her choice. I'm sure, she said. You make me feel safe and valued and beautiful, and I want to see where this goes between us. What happened between them that night was tender and passionate, and healing in ways Sophia hadn't known she needed. Mateo worshipped her body like it was precious, like every touch was a gift rather than something owed to him. He checked in with her constantly, making sure she was comfortable and present, and choosing every moment of intimacy freely. Afterward, lying in his arms while he traced gentle patterns on her skin, Sophia felt more at peace than she had in years. This was what love was supposed to feel like, she realized. Safe and generous and empowering rather than diminishing. But their fragile happiness was shattered the next morning when Sophia's phone rang with a call from Benedetto's. Lorenzo's voice was tight with worry as he explained that Derek had shown up at the restaurant again, this time demanding Sophia's personal information and making threats about what would happen if they didn't cooperate. More disturbing was Derek's new strategy. He'd somehow found out about Lily and was threatening to track down Sophia's sister if Sophia didn't return to him immediately. The escalation from targeting Sophia to targeting her family changed everything, and she could see the cold calculation returning to Mateo's expression as he processed the threat. He's not going to stop, Sophia said, her voice hollow with the realization. He'll keep escalating until someone gets hurt, and it'll be my fault for not going back to him. Mateo pulled her close, his arms strong and reassuring around her shaking body. No one is getting hurt except Derek, he said firmly. And it won't be your fault when I end this permanently. You're not responsible for his choices, Kara. You're only responsible for your own. I love you, Sophia whispered against his chest, the words spilling out before she could second-guess them. I know it's complicated and dangerous and probably crazy, but I love you for protecting me and believing in me and showing me what real love looks like. Mateo's arms tightened around her, and she could feel his heartbeat accelerating beneath her cheek. I love you too, he said quietly. More than I ever thought I could love anyone. And I promise you, Derek Hoffman will never threaten you or your family again. As they held each other in the morning light streaming through his bedroom windows, Sophia made her final choice. She was staying with Mateo Romano, dangerous occupation and all, because he'd shown her that love didn't have to mean losing yourself. Love could mean finding yourself, could mean being seen and valued and protected without being controlled. The game with Derek was about to end, and Sophia was finally ready to let someone else fight her battles while she built a life worth protecting. The call came at 7:30 on a Thursday morning, shattering the peaceful routine Sophia had grown to cherish. Mateo was already dressed for the day, reviewing reports for Marco while she lingered over coffee in her silk pajamas, and they both froze when her phone began ringing with Lily's contact information. But it wasn't Lily's voice on the other end of the line. Hello, baby, Derek said, his tone sickeningly cheerful. Did you sleep well? I hope you got your rest, because today's going to be a big day for us. Sophia's blood turned to ice, and Mateo was beside her instantly, his expression shifting from concern to lethal calculation as he recognized Derek's voice. Where is she? Sophia managed to ask, though her throat felt like it was closing. Safe for now, Derek replied easily. Your little sister is quite the fighter, by the way. Took 2 of my friends to get her into the car without making a scene. But don't worry, she's unharmed. Mostly. The casual cruelty in his voice made Sophia's vision blur with terror and rage. Derek had always known exactly which threats would destroy her, and going after Lily was psychological warfare at its most vicious. Her sister was only 22, a college senior who'd never hurt anyone in her life. What do you want? Sophia whispered, though she already knew the answer. I want my girlfriend back, Derek said simply. I want you to stop playing house with your Italian boyfriend and come home where you belong. You have 2 hours to meet me at the address I'm sending you. Come alone, no police, no backup from your new friends. Just you and me, like it used to be. And if I don't? The question came out stronger than Sophia felt, but she needed to hear him say it. Then Lily learns what happens to people who get between me and what's mine, Derek said, his voice dropping to the cold tone that still haunted Sophia's nightmares. I've got nothing left to lose at this point, baby. Nothing except you. The line went dead, and Sophia stared at her phone as the address notification appeared. An abandoned warehouse in Queens, the kind of location that suggested Derek had planned this confrontation carefully. He wasn't just improvising anymore. He was escalating to his final play. "Call Marco," Matteo said immediately, his voice sharp with command. Full tactical response. "I want that location surrounded in 20 minutes. "No," Sophia said, her voice hollow with guilt and terror. He said, "Come alone. If he sees your people, he'll hurt her. This is my fault for dragging you and your family into this mess, and I have to fix it." Matteo gripped her shoulders gently but firmly, forcing her to meet his gaze. "This is not your fault," he said intensely. "Derek is a predator who escalated because he's losing control. You didn't cause this by accepting protection, and you're not fixing it by walking into a trap alone." "But it's my sister," Sophia said, tears streaming down her face. "He took Lily because of me, because I wouldn't go back to him. I can't let him hurt her for my choices." Matteo pulled her close, his embrace strong and reassuring even as she could feel the tension radiating through his body. "We're getting your sister back, Kara," he said quietly. "But we're doing it smart, not desperate. Derek made a mistake by threatening family. Now this ends permanently." The next hour was a blur of strategic planning that reminded Sophia exactly how dangerous Matteo's world really was. Marco arrived with detailed building schematics and surveillance equipment. 3 other men she'd never seen before appeared with weapons and tactical gear. They spoke in rapid Italian mixed with technical terms that suggested military or law enforcement backgrounds. "I should be there," Sophia insisted as the team prepared to deploy. "She needs to see that I came, that I tried to protect her." Matteo was already shaking his head. "Too dangerous. Derek is unstable and armed, and having you in the building creates variables we can't control. Stay here with Rosa until we bring Lily home." But Sophia had learned something about herself over the past week. Living under Matteo's protection had reminded her that she was stronger than Derek had ever allowed her to be, and stronger than her own fear had convinced her she was. "I'm not hiding while my sister is in danger," she said firmly. "I'm coming with you." The argument that followed was intense, but brief. Matteo's protective instincts warred with his recognition that Sophia had the right to make her own choices, even dangerous ones. Finally, they compromised. She would stay in the car with Marco while Matteo and his team handled the actual confrontation. The warehouse district in Queens felt like a different world from Manhattan's gleaming towers, all rusted metal and broken windows under the gray November sky. Derek had chosen his location well, somewhere isolated enough for violence, but public enough that he might have believed civilian witnesses would protect him. He was wrong about that, as he was wrong about so many things. Matteo's team moved with professional efficiency, surrounding the building while maintaining the appearance that Sophia had come alone. Derek's overconfidence had made him sloppy with security, and within minutes Marco was reporting that they'd identified 2 of Derek's friends, but no additional weapons beyond what Derek himself was carrying. From her position in Matteo's sedan, Sophia could see Derek pacing near a broken window on the building's 2nd floor. Even at this distance, she could recognize the agitated energy that meant his patience was running thin. Derek had never been good at waiting, had never been able to handle situations he couldn't control completely. "Target acquired," Marco's voice crackled through the radio. "Sister is secured on the 1st floor, east corner. 2 hostiles with the primary target. Orders?" Matteo's response was calm and precise, the voice of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions quickly. "Neutralize the associates. Take Derek alive but incapacitated. I want to speak with him personally." What happened next was over almost before Sophia could process it. Matteo's team moved through the building like shadows, and within minutes Derek's friends were unconscious on the warehouse floor, while Derek himself was forced to his knees in front of the man who had become his worst nightmare. From her car, Sophia could see Matteo approaching Derek with the kind of controlled predator grace that made him so magnetic and so dangerous. She couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see Derek's growing terror as he realized exactly who he'd been threatening and exactly how outmatched he truly was. The confrontation lasted less than 10 minutes. Derek tried to bargain, tried to threaten, tried to convince Matteo that Sophia wasn't worth the trouble she'd cause him. But Matteo's response was swift and final, ending Derek's threats with the kind of permanent solution that men in his position used to protect their families. When it was over, When Derek's reign of terror had been reduced to a problem that would never trouble anyone again, Mateo emerged from the warehouse carrying Lily in his arms. Sophia's sister was shaken but unharmed, and she clung to Sophia with the desperate relief of someone who genuinely believed she might not survive the day. "Thank you," Lily whispered to Mateo through her tears. "Thank you for saving me, for protecting my sister, for being someone she could trust." "Family protects family," Mateo replied simply, and Sophia felt her heart clench with love and gratitude for this man who'd made her sister's safety as important as his own. Later, after Lily had been safely delivered to their parents and the warehouse had been cleaned of any evidence that might complicate their lives, Sophia and Mateo sat in his penthouse living room processing what had happened. The crisis was over, Derek's threats permanently ended, but the reality of what Mateo had done hung between them like a bridge they needed to cross together. "Are you afraid of me now?" Mateo asked quietly, his gray-green eyes searching her face for signs of judgment or withdrawal. "Now that you've seen what I'm capable of when someone threatens my family?" Sophia considered the question seriously, examining her feelings about the violence that had been done in her name. She should probably be horrified by how easily Mateo had eliminated Derek, should be disturbed by the casual efficiency with which he'd removed a human life from the world. But all she felt was profound relief and gratitude. Derek had been a cancer in her life, a source of fear and pain that had followed her across the country and threatened the people she loved most. Mateo had cut out that cancer with surgical precision, protecting not just her, but her entire family from future harm. "No," she said finally. "I'm not afraid of you. I'm grateful that someone finally made him stop. I'm grateful that my sister is safe. And I'm grateful that I found a man strong enough to protect the people he loves, whatever that requires." Mateo's relief was visible, tension leaving his shoulders as he realized that his actions hadn't driven her away. "You understand what this means?" he asked. "What my world requires, what loving me means." Sophia moved closer to him on the sofa, taking his hands in hers. "I understand that you're dangerous to people who threaten your family," she said. "I understand that you operate outside normal legal boundaries when necessary. And I understand that you'd do anything to keep me safe, just like I'd do anything to keep you safe." She paused, meeting his intense gaze steadily. "I also understand that you've never used your power to control or diminish me, only to protect me. You've shown me what real love looks like, Mateo. Safe and generous and empowering. I want this life with you, all of it." Mateo pulled her into his arms then, holding her close while they both processed the magnitude of what they'd survived together. The external threat that had brought them together was gone, eliminated so completely that it could never resurface to haunt their future. But more than that, they'd passed the ultimate test of their relationship. Sophia had seen Mateo at his most dangerous and chosen to stay. She'd witnessed the violence he was capable of and recognized it as protection rather than threat. She understood now that loving a man like Mateo Romano meant accepting his world completely, and she was ready for that acceptance. The game with Derek was finally over, ended not with police reports or restraining orders, but with the kind of permanent justice that men like Mateo dispensed when legal solutions proved inadequate. Sophia had been protected, her family was safe, and the man who'd terrorized her for so long would never hurt anyone again. As she fell asleep that night in Mateo's arms, surrounded by the luxury and security his power provided, Sophia felt truly free for the first time in years. Free from fear, free from Derek's control, and free to love a dangerous man who'd proven that his strength would always be used to shelter rather than subjugate her. Tomorrow they would begin planning their real future together, but tonight was for celebrating survival and the kind of love that conquered even the darkest threats. The weeks following Derek's elimination passed in a blur of healing and adjustment that felt both surreal and completely natural. Sophia found herself sleeping through the night for the first time in months, no longer startling awake at every small sound or checking her phone obsessively for threatening messages. The constant tension that had lived in her shoulders since fleeing California finally began to ease, replaced by a peace she'd forgotten was possible. Mateo was patient with her recovery process, understanding that trauma didn't disappear overnight even when its source had been permanently removed. He held her when nightmares occasionally surfaced, listened when she needed to talk through her guilt about Lily's kidnapping, and gradually helped her rebuild her confidence in a world where Derek's shadow no longer loomed. 2 weeks after the warehouse confrontation, Matteo took her to Sunday dinner with his extended family, and Sophia finally understood what real acceptance looked like. Elena Romano held court at the head of a massive dining table surrounded by children and grandchildren and cousins, all of whom welcomed Sophia like she'd been part of their lives for years rather than weeks. Marco was there with his wife and twin daughters, and Alessandro had brought his law school girlfriend who peppered Sophia with questions about graphic design and expressed genuine interest in her professional background. The conversation flowed easily between English and Italian, with multiple conversations happening simultaneously while children chased each other through the house, and the women collaborated on an elaborate meal that seemed to appear effortlessly. "You see how they love you?" Matteo murmured in her ear as they watched his young nieces teaching Sophia a clapping game after dinner. "This is what family looks like when it's done right. No one trying to control or diminish anyone else. Just people choosing to care for each other." The observation made Sophia's heart ache with gratitude and possibility. Derek had isolated her from her own family so gradually that she'd almost forgotten what healthy relationships looked like. But watching Matteo's family interact reminded her that love was supposed to multiply rather than divide, supposed to expand your world rather than shrink it. A month later, as autumn deepened into winter and New York prepared for the holidays, Matteo surprised her with a proposal that was both completely unexpected and perfectly suited to who they'd become together. They were cooking dinner in his penthouse kitchen, working side by side in the comfortable rhythm they'd developed over weeks of domestic collaboration, when he suddenly turned off the stove and took her hands in his. "Sophia," he said, his accent thicker than usual with emotion, "I know we've only known each other for 2 months, and I know our beginning was unconventional, but I need to ask you something important." Her heart began racing at the serious tone in his voice, but his expression was warm rather than worried, excited rather than anxious. "You've changed everything for me, Cara," he continued. "Before I met you, I thought protection meant keeping people at arm's length, making sure my dangerous world never touched anyone I cared about. But loving you taught me that real protection means bringing someone close enough to shelter them completely, means sharing your strength rather than hiding it." Sophia felt tears beginning to blur her vision as she realized where his words were leading. "I want to spend the rest of my life protecting you and being protected by you," Matteo said, dropping to one knee and producing a velvet box that must have been hidden in his jacket pocket. "I want to build a family with you, want to show you every day that love doesn't have to mean losing yourself. Sophia-chan, will you marry me?" The ring inside the box was perfect, a classic solitaire that was elegant without being ostentatious, clearly expensive but chosen for beauty rather than size. It was exactly what she would have chosen for herself, which somehow didn't surprise her at all. "Yes," she whispered, then said it louder as joy flooded through her entire body. "Yes, of course, yes. I love you, Matteo. I love your family. I love the life we're building together, and I want all of it forever." When he slipped the ring onto her finger, Sophia felt something she'd never experienced before, complete certainty about her future. There was no doubt, no fear, no voice in the back of her mind warning her about making commitments too quickly. This felt as natural and inevitable as breathing. Their engagement was celebrated with champagne and tears and phone calls to both their families, and the wedding planning that followed was surprisingly stress-free. Elena Romano took charge of arrangements with the kind of efficient enthusiasm that brooked no argument, while Sophia found herself embracing traditions she'd never imagined wanting. The ceremony itself was held 6 weeks later in the same Bronx church where 4 generations of Romanos had been married, with Lily serving as maid of honor and Marco standing as Matteo's best man. Sophia wore Elena's wedding dress, altered to fit her perfectly, and carried white roses that matched the ones in Elena's own wedding photos from 1965. When Father Benedetto pronounced them husband and wife, when Matteo kissed her with the kind of reverent passion that made the congregation cheer, Sophia felt the final pieces of her new life clicking into place. She was no longer running from someone who wanted to own her. She was running towards someone who wanted to cherish her. The reception lasted until nearly dawn, filled with dancing and laughter, and the kind of joyous celebration that reminded Sophia why people fell in love and got married in the first place. This was what she dreamed of during the lonely years with Derek, this sense of belonging and acceptance and unconditional support. Their honeymoon in Sicily was 2 weeks of sunshine and wine and long conversations about their plans for the future, and when they returned to New York, Sophia felt ready to fully embrace her new role as Matteo's wife and partner. The next 6 months passed in a whirlwind of changes that transformed every aspect of Sophia's life in the best possible ways. She enrolled in business classes at NYU, discovering a passion for entrepreneurship that Derek had never allowed her to explore. Matteo encouraged her involvement in the legitimate sides of his family's enterprises, and she found herself helping to modernize the marketing and operations of their restaurant chain. When Lorenzo approached her about buying into Benedetto's as a partial owner, Sophia felt like her life had come full circle. The restaurant where she'd worked as a frightened refugee from her old life was now becoming part of her new identity as a confident businesswoman and member of the Romano family. But the most profound change came on a sunny May morning when Sophia realized her period was 2 weeks late. The pregnancy test she took in their marble bathroom showed positive results that sent her into a tailspin of joy and terror that she immediately needed to share with Matteo. She found him in his home office reviewing contracts, and the words tumbled out of her before she could second-guess herself. "I'm pregnant," she announced, holding up the test like evidence in a court case. "We're going to have a baby." Matteo's reaction was everything she could have hoped for and more. He swept her into his arms with a whoop of joy that probably woke the neighbors, spinning her around while she laughed and cried and held on to him like he was the only solid thing in a world suddenly full of wonderful possibilities. "You're happy?" she asked when he finally set her down, needing confirmation that this development was as welcome to him as it was terrifying and amazing to her. "Happy doesn't even begin to cover it, cara mia," he replied, his hands already moving to rest protectively over her still flat stomach. "You're giving me the family I always dreamed of but never thought I deserved." And now, 6 months into their marriage and 3 months into her pregnancy, Sophia stood in the kitchen of Benedetto's during the lunch rush, watching the controlled chaos that she was now part owner of. Her hand rested unconsciously on the small bump that was just beginning to show beneath her elegant maternity dress, and she marveled at how completely her life had changed. The restaurant was busier than ever, partly due to the new marketing strategies she'd implemented and partly due to the Romano family's growing reputation for excellence in everything they touched. She'd hired 2 new servers and expanded the wine menu, and the reviews that came in consistently praised both the food and the atmosphere she'd helped create. Mrs. Romano called Giuseppe, the head chef, "You have a visitor at table 7. Sophia looked up to see Matteo settling into the corner booth where they'd first met, his expensive suit and commanding presence still turning heads even though the staff had grown accustomed to his regular appearances. He caught her eye across the crowded room and smiled, the expression warm and proud and full of the kind of love that still took her breath away. As she approached his table, Sophia thought about how much had changed since that terrifying night when Derek had stormed into her workplace and Matteo had stepped forward to protect her. She was no longer the frightened woman hiding behind other people's kindness. She was confident, successful, loved, and expecting a child with a man who treated her like she was the most precious thing in his world. "How are my 2 favorite people today?" Matteo asked as she slid into the booth beside him, his hand immediately moving to cover her small bump with the possessive tenderness she'd grown to love. "Growing," Sophia replied with a smile. "The baby was very active this morning. I think he or she is going to be as energetic as their father." The conversation was interrupted by her phone buzzing with a text from Lily, now graduated from college and working as a social media manager for a nonprofit in Boston. Her sister had thrived in the months since Derek's elimination, blossoming into the confident young woman she'd been before trauma had touched their family. But as Sophia read Lily's message about her new job and her serious boyfriend, she found herself thinking about all the women who were still trapped in situations like the one she'd escaped. Women who didn't have a Matteo Romano to step between them and their abusers, who were facing their demons alone and afraid. That thought sparked an idea that had been germinating for weeks, and she turned to Matteo with the kind of excitement that meant her entrepreneurial mind was working overtime. What would you think about starting a foundation? She asked. Something to help women escape abusive relationships, provide them with resources and safe housing and job training. Use some of our resources to make sure other women don't have to face what I faced alone. Mateo's smile was brilliant with pride and admiration. I think that's exactly the kind of project the world needs, and exactly the kind of woman I married, he said. Someone who turns her pain into purpose and uses her strength to protect others. Before they could discuss the foundation idea further, Sophia noticed a young woman at a nearby table who looked familiar in a way that made her stomach clench with recognition. The girl couldn't have been more than 25, and she kept checking her phone anxiously while scanning the restaurant like she expected someone dangerous to appear at any moment. Sophia had seen that expression in her own mirror too many times to mistake it for anything other than what it was. This young woman was afraid, was looking over her shoulder, was probably running from someone who claimed to love her but treated her like property. Here's a question for all the incredible people following our story, Sophia thought to herself as she watched the nervous young woman. How many of us have witnessed someone in a dangerous relationship and wondered if we should step in? How many times have you seen the signs and wished you knew how to help? Share your thoughts in the comments, because recognizing when someone needs protection is the first step in becoming someone who can provide it. As if responding to some unspoken signal, the young woman's phone rang, and Sophia watched her face crumple with the kind of fear that was all too familiar. Without hesitation, Sophia stood up and approached the girl's table. "Excuse me," she said gently. "I'm Sophia Romano, and I own this restaurant. I couldn't help but notice that you seem upset. Is there anything I can do to help?" The girl looked up with eyes that were bright with unshed tears and the kind of desperate gratitude that came from having someone finally notice your pain. "I don't know," she whispered. "I don't know what to do anymore." Sophia glanced back at Mateo, who was already on his feet and moving toward them with the protective instincts that made him the man she'd fallen in love with. Together, they would help this young woman find her way to safety, just as they would help countless others through the foundation they were going to build. Because this was what love looked like when it was done right. Not two people hiding from the world, but two people using their combined strength to make the world safer for everyone who needed protection. As Sophia took the frightened young woman's hand and began explaining that she wasn't alone anymore, that help was available and escape was possible, she felt the baby flutter in her womb and smiled. Her child was going to grow up in a world where love meant safety, where strength was used to protect rather than control, and where no one had to face their demons alone. The circle was complete. The terrified waitress who had frozen mid-shift when her abuser walked in had become the confident woman who stepped forward when someone else needed saving. And the dangerous man who had said, "Wait outside, I'll take care of this," had kept his promise in every way that mattered. They had found each other in crisis and chosen each other in love. And now they were building a future where their hard-won happiness could become a refuge for others who needed the kind of protection only true love could provide.